Everyone, welcome back to another video learning Windows PowerShell in our channel Telugulo Telusko. In this video we are going to talk about objects. So objects are the essential core part of Windows PowerShell. So everything that Windows PowerShell produces is an object. So it's quite important for us to understand how PowerShell deal with these objects and what are objects. So let's get started and understand what is an object first. So let's take a general example of an object. So anything uh, in this world can be treated as an object. For example, you take a car, you take a mobile phone, or you take any other thing, you can treat it as an object. So when you want to define an object, so how do you define an object? So let's go ahead and understand with an example of car. So if I want to define a car, I will define it based on its manufacturer, right? This is a BMW car, for example, and I define the features of the car. Okay, this is the length of the car, right? This is the width of the car, and this car has some additional features like it is an automatic transmission. It is not a manual transmission, it is an automatic transmission. It has cruise control, right? It has cruise control, and I can define various other features as well to describe this car, and now there will be some functionality within which you can operate that particular car. For example, you can start the car, you can stop a car, you can turn on the AC, and you can also off the AC. You can on the music system, right? These are all the actions that you are performing on that particular object. So when I want to describe about a car, I describe about something called as its properties, right? A car has a cruise control, that's one of its property or feature. Or a car has a music system, or a car is an automatic transmission. These are the features essentially using which I will describe that particular car. So these are properties of that car, and whatever I am doing actions like starting the car, stopping the car, these are the actions that I am performing on that object. So now how this is related to PowerShell. So essentially everything that PowerShell produces something called as an object, right? So in this example, the type of the object is car. The type of the object is car. If you have taken a mobile phone, the type of the object would be have been mobile, right? Similarly, in PowerShell, every object has its own type. Every object has its own type, right? It depends on what kind of object it is producing. The type of the object depends on what object is being produced. Similar to the car, every object has its properties and its methods. So properties essentially talk about the features or provide information about the object, and then methods perform actions on that object. So this is how objects are actually dealt in within PowerShell, and this is really powerful, and this is what essentially makes PowerShell very unique and powerful itself. So because the object has a lot of information itself. Traditionally, when you would have used a command prompt, you typed ping, something like ping.google.com. So whatever essentially you get as an output on the console is a piece of text. You cannot do anything with the text. Apart from reading the text and understanding, okay, this is working, okay, ping is working to Google. So essentially to an extent you can deal with only that point, or alternatively you can save that information to a file. So this is what mostly you can do with shells like command prompt. But when the same action is performed within PowerShell, so we don't use ping in PowerShell, we use something called as test dash connection. So this is some sort of replacement for ping, and this is a PowerShell native equivalent command. So this is a PowerShell native command. Ping is a separate executable, and test that connection is something native to PowerShell, which means it executes under the .NET framework. So it produces something called, so it also produces an output, but this output differs from what we have seen in the command prompt. In command prompt you are getting something called as text, but in PowerShell you get something back called as an object. So this object has its own properties and its own methods, which means I can perform some action on that particular output, or I can select the properties that I want from that output. So this way objects are really powerful within PowerShell. So if you again take the example of the car has its own properties and methods. It has display properties and some actions that you can perform on the particular object, and the type of the object is car. Now let's just relate this example with Windows PowerShell. So when I run something called as get process, what I get as an output is object, right? So this particular thing, this particular Adobe CEF helper itself is an object, and then Adobe desktop service itself is an object. So these are all essentially, every column is an object. So each column will have its own properties and its own methods. Each column will have its own properties and its own methods, which means essentially I can perform some action on this particular service, or I can read a lot of information, display information about this particular process using the object, right? Now when I run get process, what it executes and gets on the console is objects. So these are collection of objects. Each and every row that we have is an object, and each and every column that displays information about that object is called as a property. So this is how PowerShell produces objects, and objects have methods and objects have properties. So we are going to get deeper into understanding how objects works. So before we go there, let's note a couple of quick points. Every action you take in Windows PowerShell occur within the context of objects. So we understood that. An object then is a collection of data that represents an item. And again, an object is made up of three types of data. So the object will have its type, it has its methods, and it has its properties. Now let's go ahead and see how these objects work within PowerShell from my PowerShell console. Actually, I can deal with this from here. So let's go ahead and type get service. So when I just hit enter, so you can see that services are displayed on the console. So as I said, Adobe Update Service is one object and application experience is one object. So all these are different objects. Get service is producing a lot of objects. So these lot of objects are called as collection, and then it produces three display informations for me here: name, status, and display name. So these are the properties. So that's fine, but essentially the services would have more than three properties. So if you have ever done Windows administration, or if you are familiar with the services within the Windows, services normally has a lot of information apart from these three. So it is just showing me the status, name, and display name. There is a lot of other information like dependent services. dependent services, start mode, which is automatic or manual, or I have log on information, and there is a lot of other information that actually which is not displayed on the console by default. This is because when you run get service, PowerShell executes some sort of background job. I mean, in terms of like a background formatting. So when you run get service without specifying any parameters, PowerShell has a default output that need to be displayed. So this is the default output that I'm getting when I just run get service, as there is a lot of information that cannot be fit onto this particular console. PowerShell actually displays only the essential information that generally being used by audience. So now how do I see what are the complete information that is available for every object? So what you can do is get service pipe this to get command. This character is called as a pipe character, right? A pipe character. Normally on a US keyboard you would see this character right above the shift key, right above the shift key. So you can use that character, and then this gm is an alias to get member. So alternatively what I can do is I can type the complete command, which is get member, Now when I just hit return key, now let's understand what it is producing. So just forget about this pipe character at this point. This is a whole deep concept that we are going to talk about in 3 to 4 parts of videos, how the PowerShell pipeline is working. So just forget about the character at this point. But now when I want to see what a particular service or what particular commandlet producing, right, what kind of an object a particular commandlet is producing, I just need to use the get member commandlet. So the get member commandlet design by functionality is to display the information about the type name and the properties available and the methods available for a particular object. So if I go ahead and see, this get service is producing an object of type called system.serviceProcess.service controller. So in short you can just say service controller, right? So in the car example, if you recall, the type of the object is car. In this particular example, the type of the object is service controller. Now every object will have methods and properties. So as you can see, there are a lot of methods right here, and again there are a lot of properties on the console. So which means I can see, this is the display information about the services. So I can see status of the service, I can see the service type of the service, I can see the service dependent on, I can see the service name, machine name, display name. So these are all the display information. A property is essentially a display information, and methods are actions that I can perform, which means I can stop a service, I can start a service, right? I can dispose a service, I can close a service. So these are essentially actions that I am performing on a particular object. So now if you see that get dash service, let me just open a PowerShell console once again. So get dash service is producing a collection of objects, and each object has all this information. So the first object is Adobe Update Services. So Adobe Update Service has a name, has required services, has disposed, has a close method, has a continue method, and again at same time it has a service name, it has a display name, it has a machine name, for example on which machine it is running, and what type of a service is. So all these, essentially all this information, all these properties and methods are there for this object. Again, for application of experience, this is also one of the object. So for this object we will also have all these methods and properties. Similarly for each and every object right here, you have all this information, but by default this is hidden. So when I run get service, I don't get the For example, service name, I get display name instead as a default output, but I don't get a service name. I don't get a service as dependent on information. I don't get a service type information. So these all information is hidden, but I can actually go ahead and ask PowerShell to show me that information. For example, get service hyphen name adobe or bits. For example, just take bits for this particular example, and then I can say select service type, uh, this service name, and then I can take any other property. For example, can stop is also a property, and then I can also type services dependent dp and dnt on. So if I spell it right, services, or I can just go ahead and copy this. Just bear with me, I'm bad at typing. So services dependent on. Now when I just hit enter, you can see that I get only the information that I have requested. So always when you run get service, that information is there, but by default it is hidden unless you ask PowerShell to show that information. So you can see I get the service type, I get the service name, can stop, and then service dependent on. These are the services on which bits is dependent on. It can stop, yes. The service name is bits, and service type is Win32 share process. So this information is always there in the in the pipeline, but PowerShell by default doesn't show that information when you execute the command, just because the console is so small that it cannot display the complete output. So that's one of the reasons. Now let's see what the methods can do. For example, let's say if I want to just open calci. For example, when I open calci, I got a calculator. Now let's see get process, and then pipe it to get member. Now I am seeing the methods and properties of get process. So as you can see, get process produces something called as process object, right? Process object. In this case, it is producing something called as service controller object. So when I take an example of car, the object type is car, and when I take an example of mobile phone, the object type is mobile, right? Similarly, when I deal with process, the objects that get process produces is a process type, but when I deal with services, the objects produced are service controller objects by PowerShell. So each and every individual commandlet produces objects of its own type. So the methods and properties are not same, they are different for each and every type. So in this process type, I have something called as handles, npm, non-paged memory, paged memory, virtual memory, working set. So there is a lot of information that actually talks about a single process. So for every process, all this information is there. Again, by default, PowerShell doesn't show that information for you. And as you can see, there is something called as a method which is kill. A kill method normally kills the process. You know what a process killing a process does, right? It essentially closes that particular application which is running. So let's go ahead and deal with the kill process. So always remember, when you want to execute a method, you should follow this syntax, which means if I want to execute a method, I need to use kill, and I need to open and close a parenthesis. That is how you execute a method, right? So let's go ahead and get my process. So get process produces a list of processes on my computer, and if I want to select one process, which is calci, I can just hit enter. It's not calci.exe, it's just calci. Okay, there we go. Now I got this particular get process name calci. Now I want to execute a kill method on this particular object. So I want to wrap this in the parenthesis, which is a part of syntax. So now what it means is get process produces tons of objects, tons of processes objects on my computer. In that I'm just selecting one object. Now if you normally take anything, for example an integer 1, or any other example, like so if you want to specify a fraction of just a piece of it, right, you represent with a dot, right? Similar to that, like 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, just a fraction of it, not the complete thing. So this is the complete thing I'm dealing with. This is the complete thing I'm dealing with, and I just want to use a fraction of information from that method. So I am using a kill method, and when I execute, the calculator which is opened on my computer is actually killed. Now if I go ahead and run get process name calci, I get an error saying that calci is not open, cannot find a process name with the calci. That is how you execute methods. So methods always go in parentheses, right? In parentheses, open and closed parentheses. So this is how you actually deal with methods and properties. So some of the important things that you need to remember. So there is something called as alias property right here. So we already talked about alias. Alias is a what? Alias is a shortcut, right? Shortcut. So here name is a shortcut property which is created for service name. So the actual property is service name. Probably I need to scroll a little bit down to see that information. Here we go. This is the actual property, service name, but PowerShell automatically created a shortcut property for that, which is name, because essentially every object need to have a name, or PowerShell adds these things dynamically to the shell. PowerShell adds this thing dynamically to the shell. So these are called as alias property. So when I do get process select name, I get the same information, or when I say get process dash service name, I get the same set of information. For example, get service name bits gets the same output as get service name. I get the same output. There is no difference. So in the background, dash name is using dash service name. This is a shortcut that is created. Those are called as alias properties. So remember, objects produce objects always get you three informations. One is the type. What is the type of the object? For services, it is service controller. For process, it is a process object. If you take an event log, that could be a different thing. If we are taken net adapter, the net adapter objects would be different. So every command that you run produces a different object type. Now every type of objects will have properties and methods. And you can, properties are display information about that object, like service name, display name, machine name, which you cannot stop or start. You cannot perform any action on properties. But methods, on the contrast, can perform actions, which means stop a service, start a service, and then refresh a service, dispose a service, and a lot of other things, right? So those are the objects. So it is very, very important to understand objects in PowerShell, because essentially this is what make PowerShell really, really powerful. So for example, finally I just want to show you one example in my lab so that we can wrap up these objects. So let's say normally if you would have used a command prompt. Let's open a command prompt quickly and say, just a second, here command prompt, here we go. So now when I say ping google.com, so what I get in return if I have internet connection is just a piece of text popping up on my console, which I cannot deal anything, which I cannot do anything. So google.com is not working for some reason. Let's say ping local host. So what I get in return is a text, right? So this is nothing, this information I can't do anything apart from copying and pasting. But instead what I can do is test connection. For example, if I put this in a variable, test connection localhost. Now in $A, what we will have is the connection results, right? Using this connection results, if I pipe it to get member again, see I have a lot of information. So the object type here is system.management root ping status. So I can get all this information. For example, PS computer name is property, and I have a lot of properties instead of methods here. So I have a timeout, I have time to live. For example, I can select all those information, right? Select timeout, and I can also select protocol address, for example, and I can also type PS computer name, for example. I can get all this information. So when I hit enter, see I get the timeout limit, which is 4000. I get the protocol address, I get the computer name for which I have executed this. So this is how objects are very useful in PowerShell. You cannot do all these operation in command prompt using ping.exe. This is not really possible. So this is what makes PowerShell really different and unique and really powerful. So that's it for this video. Please do practice. If you really want to know more about objects, you can always go ahead and type help about objects. Help about objects. There is a lot of decent documentation. You can go through some examples what objects are, and you can also see the online version of how objects are working in PowerShell. So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like the video, please do share, like and subscribe to my channel, and it will encourage me to do more and more videos for you. Thank you and have a wonderful day.